Tom from Tom's Toons here. Today, I'm taking you through how to install a brand new Mercury 40 horsepower command thrust outboard. This is the 40 ELPT 4S, 4-stroke CT, command thrust, meaning it's that larger gear case. This motor has a 90 and 115 horsepower gear case, spins about a 14-inch prop, great with a gear reduction for a pontoon boat. Here's the cool part about this engine. They've been making this for a long time, so you may have found a good used one that you're installing on your boat. You can follow along, or you can do the same steps if you have a 50 or 60 command thrust, or even standard 50 and 60 Mercury 4-stroke in this year class from the about 2012, 13 all the way up. They're going to be very similar, if not the same. But this 40 command thrust is a 4-cylinder that shares the same engine block, same chassis, same hood and everything, just a different decal as the 50 and 60 standard and 50 and 60 command thrust. Hope that all made sense. Bottom line, this is a great engine for us to show you how to install because there's a lot of them out there, and it's an awesome engine. On this transom, it's all aluminum, plenty sturdy. We're gonna use the bolt holes that are already in there. Remember, if there's a bigger horsepower motor or a 25 and up that has power trim and tilt, it's gonna use the same hole pattern. That's the one nice thing in the outboard industry they've always done, is we have the same bolt pattern. This is in the second hole up. So we're gonna go ahead and mount it in the same place. We'll use the second hole on the outboard here. It's okay if the motor is hovering just slightly above in terms of this mounting bracket. That is totally okay. It's meant to be able to hover if it needs to. So I'm gonna go ahead and set her on there, bolt it in place, and then we'll move on from there. That'll do. On some of these larger horsepower motors, especially the Merc, the balance point, so our engine hook here, totally fine to hook on to mount that. You can see the angle here. What I need to do in order to close that gap, especially working on the ground pretty low like this, is I'm just gonna trim the motor up, and that's gonna push this bracket down flush. So don't be afraid to do that if you need to get the right angle. That gives me just the right tilt angle to run my bolts through. You're gonna get a bag of bolts, washers, and nuts. That's right in with the engine in the crate. There's a rigging box, they call it. That's got these bolts. It's got your owner's manual. It's got a fuel line, but we love washers around here. So we have 4 washers, 4 nuts. The way this is gonna work is a washer will go on the transom side, and the nut will go on the engine itself. No washer needed there. So I've got to go back up a little bit, it looks like. I like to start with the top 2 bolts. Once we get those in, then our bottom bolts are pretty much going to fall right into place. So as you can see, we went in the second hole down. Should get our cavitation plate or ventilation plate. We want to be, if we look at our pontoon here, this is the main part of the water line, somewhere in here. I want to be about 4 inches below that, because when we get this pontoon moving and up and lifted a little bit, there's going to be, water line's going to move down. So I need to make sure that this plate here, technically the ventilation plate, I need to make sure that doesn't come out of the water at all. So we're going to bury it. Still can run shallow if they trim it up, that's totally fine, but we're gonna go ahead and make sure it's about 4 inches below that main water line. And just like that, I was able to get all 4 bolts through. Nut on the back side is a nylock nut, so no need for a lock washer or anything there. I'm gonna go ahead and grab my impact, we'll tighten it down, and then we'll hand tighten it to finish. 3/4 inch socket. Once I get the top 2 tight, I'm gonna go ahead and just take my engine hoist right off. So let's get that right out of the way. That's gonna allow the engine to sit where it needs to so I can tighten the bottom bolts. And because I'm a little bit old school, not all the way old school, but I'm close, I'm gonna hand tighten just to make sure that has the tightness that I prefer, which is real snug. Real snug. All right, that looks really darn good. Transom's nice and solid. We did beef up that last support with some square tubing, so I like it. Let's talk about all of the components that are going into installing this engine, starting with our ignition harness. So this is a 20-foot harness. You want to measure to make sure you get all the right lengths of everything. So just a quick run through of measuring. I measure from the console to the back corner and then over, and I add a couple feet for the motor side because everything has to go into the engine, and then I add a couple feet or 3 feet to go up to where the controls and everything are going to mount. So keep that in mind. It gives you a ballpark. There's some schematics online you can refer to. We have an ignition harness. The motor side is going to be just one big plug. That's a 14-pin connector. And then the dash side is going to be where we plug in. This is for gauges. There's a gauge harness. If you're installing gauges, you would have to plug into this, an additional part. We're doing Vessel View, which is a fully digital Bluetooth app on your phone. We'll show you how to install that. But this is where your key switch, trim tilt, neutral safety, all of that's going to plug in. That's going to plug into your key switch. So this is our ignition key switch. It's a separate part that comes with the ignition harness. And then the other thing we have is our Lanyard stop switch. This is a kit. It doesn't come with the ignition harness or the ignition itself. This is an add-on. In Michigan, they just passed a law that you must have a safety lanyard if there was one on the boat. This is all new controls and everything. We are installing a safety lanyard. This is that Vessel View. It's around 250 bucks. But this is what we'll show you how to hook up underneath the hood of the engine. And then we have a propeller. This is a 24-foot boat. We're gonna spin a 14 by 10-inch pitch. Should be just about right. It's a pontoon. We know it's not going super fast in a 40 horsepower. But remember that command thrust is the high thrust model. It spins a 14-inch, which is actually what the 90 and 115 spin. Lastly, our shift throttle cables. So what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna run all of my electrical, my shift throttle, and my steering all up to the dash. We'll start up at the dash, get that stuff installed, and then we'll make our way back to plugging everything into the engine. All right, we've got our cable run up through the floor. This is someday we'll do a whole video on this, but we are installing a new steering cable into the original assembly here. It's a quick connect rotary style. So I'm gonna remove the sheathing off of our rotary cable. This is real messy, so just a forewarning. And I'm gonna insert, it can only go in one side, so keep that in mind. It's got a little label insert here. Now to pull that cable in, I'm gonna turn the wheel. So one way we'll push it out, one way we'll turn it in. And make sure we've got lots of slack in our cable, and you're gonna hear it, if you listen, click right into place. So now I can't push it back out. If I turn all the way the other way, it's in there nice and secure. And then one last measure of safety, this pin would be used typically to push on this detent right here, and that will help you pop the cable out when you're uninstalling. But we're gonna put it back in, and what it does is it helps lock it in place, and it stores that key or that pin for another time if you have to uninstall it. So our steering cable is in on the helm side. Let's pop back out of here because it's hot and uncomfortable. Those two items, the steering cable and then the shift throttle cables, are easiest to install from the back of the boat to the front because these are a little more flexible, a little shorter to push through holes. So I've run these up through a grommet, out through where the control box is gonna go. So those are in position. Then another quick tip, I label them when I take them out of the box. Each one shift, S for shift, and then this one has a T on it for throttle, and it's labeled on both ends. That way I don't have to even look again It's just there. When I get to the motor side, it plugs in nice and easy. Your ignition harness is easiest fed through from the top down, in my opinion. We have a nice big plug here. I'm gonna run this down through. That way I can leave all this other stuff up on the deck side and I don't have to try to finagle all that through. So we'll push this down through. I'm gonna get out and pull this all the way back to the engine. It's gonna route the same place that our shift throttle cable is routed. So it goes along the pontoon, cuts over, and then in through the transom to the engine. What we have here is the control box. So this is a binnacle mount control. This will slide down into the dash, and this will be the cover. One major important thing before you get to doing anything else is make sure that this, I guess you could call it the bezel or a gasket of sorts, but this piece, make sure it goes on first before you install any cables in your controls. So I'm gonna go ahead and mock this up, get it as straight as I can. I've already cut my hole out for it. This also acts as a stencil, which is pretty nice. But I'm gonna go ahead and drill these 4 holes so that when everything comes together, we're ready to go. And for these holes, you can do a 3/16 or slightly smaller. When I go into the plastic helms like this from Pontoon stuff, I tend to go a little bit smaller. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Our next thing is opening up the back side. So this plastic piece is gonna come right off, and that's gonna allow us to actually insert our shift throttle cables. This panel, it's always got grease on it, so keep an eye out. Store it somewhere it's not gonna get all over the place. Look at it, I have a smiley face up there, huh? On this engine, we have to double check, and this goes for any engine you're installing, to see which direction is going to shift into forward and which direction is your throttle going to travel. Is it a push or a pull throttle? So on the control box, I have 4 points of connection. I'm only going to use 2 of those. One will be shift and one will be throttle. So if I watch the mechanism when I shift, this post would be pulling into forward, which is most common. And then throttle, when I continue on, this is either of these points are throttle. If I push, this would be pull to throttle. This would be push to throttle. So you have to remember your cable is pushed or pulled inside that sheathing. So let's look at the motor real quick and just double check which is which. So our shift mechanism is right here. It comes in neutral from the factory. It is indeed a pull into forward. So that puts it in forward, it's locked in forward. And then would push into reverse. So we'll remember that. And then our throttle body is back here. There's a post with a pin on it. And that is gonna pull to go faster to open the throttle. It can't push. So we have a pull to shift and a pull to throttle. Pull to shift forward and a pull to throttle. Let's go back to our control box. So remembering those things, we have a pull to shift. We're gonna use this for our shift. And then we have a pull to throttle. So both of my cables will run through this slot. Super important point. These are Gen 2 shift throttle cables. If you're installing on a new style control box, this is a brand new style from Mercury, and I actually really like it because there's a shift detent. The other style would just shift without having to actually lift the detent up and then shift. And it got tricky for a lot of people finding neutral, finding forward, having issues with the neutral safety and so on. So I really like this style, but this is Gen 2 cables because they have a little groove in them here that's actually gonna slide right down. I'll show you how this works right now. We're gonna do our shift cable on the bottom. So that's my S for shift. I'm gonna slide that groove right into the control box there. So now when I shift, this piece can move independently, and that's actually pushing and pulling the cable that's inside of the sheathing. So I'm gonna pull that right into position here. Set it on that post, and then you're given, these are little hex machine screws, but they do have a flathead screwdriver post on them. And that's gonna thread right down on there. And that is what holds your shift cable on. Now, because I'm going straight in this same side, I'm going to use a little spacer. You have a whole bunch of little spacers that come with. This will position down in here to create that gap that needs to be there between your shift cable and your throttle cable. So throttle cable, again, it has that groove. Your shift and throttle cables are identical. Make note of that. They look the exact same. You just determine which one you want to use for each. We'll hold that in place. We'll put that other machine screw in, and they come with a little bit of thread lock on them. I do have a couple of big inserts that are going to block, just to keep creepy crawlies and other things from wanting to climb into your control box. Or you would use those if you have a different style pull or push shift throttle cable. This yellow and red wire is coming out from a switch that's built into the control box, and that's the neutral safety wires, which is connected to the neutral safety switch. That's it for inside of this control box. Surprisingly simple, which is always a good thing. I'm just going to set this back on, and then I'll put these machine screws back in. And you can hand tighten or gently tighten them down with your impact. You have a total of 5 of these screws that hold that back plate, but that also a plate helps hold your shift throttle cables in place too. The other wires coming off, to keep in mind, this is your trim and tilt connection, so that'll plug into our ignition harness. That's it for the cables. Now we have to put on our actual spacers or brackets that are going to hold the box in place. So these allow you to have a height adjustment for your dash and a little bit of an angle adjustment, so they come in handy. These will bolt right on each side. This is the side. These holes here are going to go into those dash holes that I drilled in. These are going to go into these 2 big holes in the control box. So you're given 2 longer machine screws. Those are what are going to go through, and then there's a nylock nut on each one on the other side. So what these allow you to do is have some freedom in terms of the angle, so I could adjust my tilt, the angle of the control box, or the height of the control box where it sits on the dash. I should note, this is always way easier to do when you're sitting in a chair and you can have the control box on your lap, but we'll make it work. 3/8 inch socket, and the Phillips will tighten these up. And you want to wait until you get it completely, or get it started on the dash before you tighten that all the way, because you may change the angle. I'm going to run my neutral safety wires down through, and I'm going to make sure that my trim and tilt wires can go through too. This is where you might have to get under there and pull on your cables a little bit, because right now mine are bunched up in here. You just have to take some slack out, and then this will sit down in a position. So typically when I install this, I start with the brackets on the control box all the way up. So making the control box as high up as possible. We can always adjust these once we get everything screwed in place going through the dash. And then we can run those machine screws through. Nice thing is, without being hooked up to the engine, I can shift and throttle no problem to get that out of my way. This becomes a 2-person job because things need to be tightened from both sides. So I've got these snug down. These are one of the stranger designs I've ever seen, but they're pretty effective. So this is your nut essentially for the control box. So it's a rubber, and what's going to do is it's going to squeeze down and it's going to compress. So it allows you to go through a variety of different depths of consoles, but that's going to put pressure on the nut bolt connection. It's going to keep it in place forever. So I'm going to go down on the back side and just hand start these, and then I can tighten more from the top. That turned into a 2-person job, just somebody running the machine screw in from the top while I held those in place until they get tight. Then you can crank on them nice and tight. So we're going to double check this. This tends to happen. My throttle wants to run all the way into my switch panel at wide open. So that'd be a bummer if I was turning my switches off, going wide open. So that's where I can now adjust the angle here. So if I drop the backside down slightly, it'll tilt my whole mechanism just a little bit, and that'll give me room to run that throttle wide open without interfering with the switch panel. And I did mount this pretty low. Now, no interference. My switches can be on, so it's just a little adjustment to make that work. I did go in while we were adjusting the angle and fix that and added the proper washer on that tilt angle designed for the binnacle. The last thing to do on this top side for the shift throttle is going to be to add our cover in place here. This little clip will catch on the back side, so that'll kind of drop into place. Make the back flush, then you can press the front into position, and this little black set screw, little Phillips head, will go into place to hold the box together. We'll hand tighten that down, and just like that, we've now got our shift throttle ready to go. You do have a throttle only option on this, so you push that button in and then you can advance the throttle, and that'll let you rev it up. On a fuel injected motor, you never use that. You really never need to rev it up to warm up. It'll take care of itself. We've got to install a key switch and our safety lanyard, then we can go to the engine side. We're moving on to our key switch first, and just decide where you want that to go. I will tell you, these little decals here, they don't stick very well to the Pontoon stuff console just because of the texture. So I usually don't install those. It's just a off on start. But the key is just like your car. You don't think about it when you turn it. You'll be just fine. This is all the key switch assembly is. What we have is a little detent device that's going to hold this key switch in place and keep it from twisting and turning. So we'll take the key right out, and then there's a little sticker here that says yellow dot down. That will be positioned down, and that would allow, if water got in there, it could drain out. That's the position they want it in. So if I use this little detent clip here, it will position itself right in. There's a little key that's going to catch, and that little detent on the front is going to go into the back side of the dash and hold that in place, so when I turn the key, the whole mechanism doesn't spin with it. So in order to do this, what I do is I cut my hole just a little bit smaller, and then I'll take my Dremel and I'll flatten out the top and the bottom. That help. And then we do have to drill a hole through the console for this little detent device to grab onto so that it can't turn. Then the nut, plastic nut, will go on top and sandwich everything together. So choosing your spot where this is going to go, I've installed the key switch down on this flat portion here. The last couple I've done, I've really liked, I've put up next to the shift throttle, and it's really easy. Turn the key and go. You don't have to reach down and find it. So what I'm going to do is install my key switch right in this bottom corner here, and my safety lanyard I'll put on this vertical portion, and that way we'll have a nice look and convenient design. I'm going to start by drilling a hole where I'm going to position this, and then I'm going to run this to 3/4 of an inch. And you'll find that it's just not quite big enough at 3/4 inch, which is okay. So I'm going to take my Dremel tool and I'm just going to flatten off the top part a little bit and the bottom part a little bit to make for that flat design, which is going to help resist this from twisting. We've got the fit right, real snug. I've got my detent that goes on first. And this is where I have to drill that hole, so not a great way to mark exactly where your hole is going to be, but I'm going to do my best to line everything up. And I have a 5/32 drill bit, so I know that I'm going to be just slightly underneath. And don't worry about the hole. Your plastic nut that goes on top of everything is going to go ahead and cover that hole. So we can test everything from the front side. That looks good. Test it with the key switch. That locks everything in nice and snug so it can't turn. So now I'm gonna go from the back side, and I'm gonna push this through. My little detent will catch my hole, and then I can put the big plastic washer on from the outside. And remember, this is a plastic nut with plastic threads. So I'm gonna do my best to hand tighten it. If I tighten it with a wrench at all, it's gonna be, you know, 1/8 of a turn or 1/4 of a turn at the most usually. But that's in place. I can now put my key in, the on position, the start position, and it comes back to that on position vertical. So I like where that's at. We'll make sure this is tight, and then we can move on to our safety lanyard.
Let me see River.
It's his crown, it's his birthday crown.
Birthday boy!
Our safety lanyard, get all my parts and pieces out here. You know, for just needing to install this one little switch, they sure give you a lot of stuff. So you're not gonna use this unless your wires are gonna be exposed. This would allow you to install it on the dash, run your wires out. We're not doing that, we're gonna hide our wires. They're gonna go back into the console. So I have a plate. This is what's gonna actually be attached to the console, and then my switch will go inside of that. First thing I have to do is figure out where I want to mount my plate. So this is oriented for the switch. There's a little part of the plastic that sticks out that's going to line up with this little groove here so that it's oriented the correct position, where to be able to start the motor, you're in run, and if you were to be wearing this like you should, and you fly out of the boat or out of your seat, it pulls and it flips that switch to off. So to reinstall that, I just push this underneath and turn the switch back to run. Pretty simple design. It turns the motor off if you fall out of your seat or out of the boat. If you're having trouble starting your motor ever, that's the first thing you should check, and then make sure to check that your shift throttle is indeed in neutral. We're gonna go down below the key switch with this. We've got our gasket, we've got a retaining clip. That's all where it needs to be. So we've got a 2-inch hole cut here for my wires and everything to slide through. We've got a gasket on, that retaining clip in place on the back. We'll make sure this is vertical. And that's a pretty simple process for putting the back on. This is gonna mount on the back side. This is gonna hold it in place against the console. And I'll just run these machine screws through. It's gonna get a washer and a nut on the back of these, and that's it. We can hook our lanyard up, and then we'll do all of our plug and play electrical, and then we can go back to the engine and get installing everything back there. Our lanyard is in place. All I have to do now is take my harness and plug in the items that I need to get this motor running, which are my key switch. Nice thing about Mercury is that they label these, so this is gonna plug right into the back of the key switch. I have my lanyard, so remember I have a solid black and then a black with a yellow. Those will plug into those wires. You gotta just remove the caps, bullet connectors, away you go. And then we have one more. This says remote control, which is referring to our remote control, the binnacle mount. For our neutral safety, this is gonna plug into the corresponding yellow with the red stripe. And then this last little plug, it has a little triangle at the top, so it can only go in one way. That is our trim and tilt. So those are what I'm plugging in. These other wires, well, you may or may not use. This would be for your gauges. This is SmartCraft capable. Or if you're wiring to an old school analog gauge kit, you would get a harness that's a gauge harness that comes in and then it has pigtails coming off so you can splice in. We're not using this. We're doing vessel view, so we're good there. So I'm going to climb underneath, plug these in, and then let's go back to the outboard. Remember, before you head out on the water, double check to make sure that your neutral safety switch is working in both directions. And then your safety lanyard, if that's pulled off, it'll crank, but it won't crank over. So remember that. Check those before you head out on the water to make sure you're safe and ready to go.